Bienvenidos and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Ana Sofia Lahovary, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. Before I introduce tonight's program, I would like to mention 3 upcoming programs that we have at the Dole Institute. Tomorrow, Wednesday, the 21st at 4 p.m., our discussion group program with Fall Fellow and Wall Street journalist Jerry Seib continues. We started last Wednesday and the attendance was absolutely fantastic. This September's theme is 2022 mid-elections, big stakes and big consequences. The topic tomorrow is political polarization and how it affects this year's races. We have an update to our guest speakers. Joining us will be Kathleen Sebelius, former United States Secretary of Health and Human Services and Kansas governor, and Neil Newhouse, poster for 4 Republican presidential campaigns and a range of congressional contests. The Dole Fellows Program is made possible by Newman's Own Foundation, and Jerry Seib's residency is sponsored by the Dole Simons Family Fund. On Thursday, September the 29th, we hope you will join us at 7 p.m. for the 2022 Constitution Day program with KU Law Professor Lou Mulligan, who will be the moderator, and our panelists will be Canon Shanmugam, who's chair of the Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison Supreme Court and Appellate Litigation Practice; Paul Davis, who's a KU graduate and former Kansas representative and House Minority Leader. We're very proud both of these people are Lawrence natives. Our third panelist will be Ryan Kriegshauser, former General Counsel for the Office of Kansas Securities Commissioner and Deputy Assistant to Secretary of the State for the Office of Legal Counsel and Policy in Kansas. They will discuss recent constitutional law cases from Dobbs to redistricting, focusing upon their potential effects here in Kansas. The Dole Institute's Constitution Day program is made possible by the support of a longtime friend of the Dole Institute, Mark P. Johnson. We thank you. Our third program will be Wednesday, October the 5th at 7 p.m. And Sherry Rollins Weston, president of Sesame Workshop, will deliver the 5th Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture, which features women who break barriers, make significant contributions to their fields, and reach positions of leadership. Sesame Workshop is the nonprofit educational organization behind Sesame Street. Rollins Weston leads the organization's efforts to serve vulnerable children through mass media and targeted initiatives in the United States and around the world. We hope you will be able to attend these programs. Now we'll continue with our program for this evening. Tonight's interview will be conducted by the Dole Institute's director, Audrey Coleman. The Dole Leadership Prize is a bipartisan award presented annually to an individual who demonstrates the importance of involvement in political and civic affairs. President Santos was suggested by the late Senator Bob Dole in recognition of his successful efforts to bring peace to Colombia. Santos graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in economics and administration and completed postgraduate studies at the London School of Economics and Harvard University. The president's 2012 visit marked the first time the Dole Institute hosted a sitting head of state. He served 2 terms as President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018, with one of the cornerstones of his administration being his work on a peace process with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as FARC, the Colombia Guerrilla Organization. As a result of this commitment to achieve peace in Colombia, he was the sole recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 for his resolute efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end, according to the Norwegian Nobel Committee. We are honored to welcome President Santos back to the University of Kansas and the Dole Institute to present him with the 2022 Dole Leadership Prize. I will have to say that Bill Lacey would love to have been here this evening, but he's out of town with his wife because her brother is quite ill. So I would say at this point, we have a loyal Jayhawk alum, and I would ask all of you to please join me and give him a very warm Jayhawk welcome to President Juan Manuel Santos.
Barbara, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Mr. President. It's such a pleasure to see you here at the Dole Institute. Again, we were talking in the green room that it's been 10 years since you visited here, the first time during your first term as president, and then since 2017 that you visited KU. So this is a really special opportunity for us. You were just in South Bend, Indiana. What were you doing there?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be in my alma mater again and to be in the Dole Institute. I was in South Bend, Indiana, because the University of Notre Dame has an institution called the Kroc Institution for International Peace. And that is an institution that started to follow up on peace processes around the world. Many of the peace processes failed because they were not implemented. What was agreed was simply agreed, but it didn't materialize. And so they started finding ways how to measure the implementation. And when we were negotiating with the FARC, we knew that the implementation was key to the success of the peace process, and we started to look for somebody that would have the trust of both sides. And the Kroc Institute sort of appeared, and relatively easy because each decision was very complicated, but they were chosen as the institution that would officially measure the implementation of what was agreed. And they invited me to spend a week there in Notre Dame to talk to their staff. They have about 50 people in this institution, to talk to students, to talk to the teachers, and to bring them luck in their football game. Because they had been losing. And fortunately, they won on Saturday, as Kansas did also.
Well, many of those in our audience will already know about your connection to KU, but will you remind us how you first became acquainted with KU and maybe a couple of stories about your experiences here on campus, the safe ones?
Well, No, I come from a family, newspaper family. My family owned the oldest newspaper in Colombia, 100 years, family business. And one of my older brothers was looking for a university to study journalism. And my father had a friend of his, he was the publisher of the Miami Herald, stayed at my house. And my brother asked him, this publisher, where do you recommend me to go study journalism? And he said, well, there is a very, very good school of journalism called the William Allen White School of Journalism. The problem is it's located in the middle of nowhere. It's in Kansas, but this has an advantage. You can go there, study good journalism, and get to know what America is really about. If you go to the East Coast or the West Coast, that's not the real America. You go there and you will learn what the United States is made of. If you don't like it, you can always transfer. He came here, he fell in love with KU, and he wrote to me, he said, when I started looking for a university, he said, don't look, come to Kansas, you will fall in love. And that happened. I came here and I fell in love, and I was here for 4 years. My younger brother came here. 3 of my cousins came here. My older brother married here, had his son, who's right here. He lives in Kansas. My nephew married a Kansan. They have a daughter born in Lawrence, and she's going to have my great-grandniece or nephew in a few months. So it's 4 generations with Santos related to KU.
That's fantastic. The late Senator Bob Dole identified you as a candidate for this year's Dole Leadership Prize, and we'll present that at the conclusion of our program. Can you tell us a little bit about what receiving this recognition means to you?
Well, when I received the letter and that Senator Dole himself had suggested my name, I feel extremely honored. I had great admiration for Senator Dole. I met him many years ago in the late 80s, early 90s. The gentleman here sitting in front of me, Ed Seaton, he's a publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. We worked together in the Inter-American Press Society, and he was present when Senator Dole was helping to get funds to remake a newspaper that had been blown up by the drug cartels in Colombia. That was the first time I met him. Later on, I had to go visit him in the US Senate. I was already a Minister of Trade. We had a very close relationship with the US, and something called the Andean Trade Preference Act was being approved in Congress, a law that gave trade preferences to Colombia. And Senator Dole was very important in making that happen. So I went to visit him, and he helped very much. So that's how I got to know Senator Dole. I also met his wife, extraordinary person, and he's an example of a good politician. And I am so pleased and so encouraged that every time somebody speaks about the Dole Institute, they start by saying a bipartisan. Institute. This is so much needed, not only here in the US, worldwide. The politics have become a very aggressive activity. This polarization has made democracies more ineffective, because when you're polarized, you can't agree on anything, and then government doesn't work. And so that's why I'm so happy that in this institute you are promoting this sort of bipartisan approach to politics. This is very, very urgently needed all around the world. And of course, I feel extremely honored to have been probably the latest person awarded this prize, recommended by the Senator Dole.
Yes.
That is something that I will keep in my heart until the end of my life.
Thank you. When we were visiting yesterday, you mentioned about how peace wasn't necessarily always on your mind as a leader, perhaps not in your mind as president, or even in your service as defense minister. What happened to change your mind, to inspire you to seek peace? Was there a certain event, or can you talk about what inspired you to make that decision?
Well, it's like so many events that happen to you in your life or during history. It's not a one moment that you suddenly see the light. It's an accumulation of different factors. For example, when I was a journalist, I went to live in London for 10 years. In the diplomatic area, I was a delegate of Colombia in the International Coffee Organization. I saw there the IRA terrorism attacking the United Kingdom institution and foundation. I was very impressed by that. When I went back to Colombia, I started to work in the newspaper as a journalist, and I started to be surprised, and not very pleasantly surprised, that the Colombians were losing their capacity to feel compassion. And why do I say this? Because I remember that if we had a massacre that was less than 15 people, 10 people, then it was not front page news. So the capacity to feel for people who were suffering or dying, we were losing that. And later on, when I went into public office, I was appointed the Minister of Trade, the first Minister of Trade that Colombia had, and I went to New York. I was in charge of opening up the economy, of modernizing the economy, so we needed investment. And we went to New York to a conference. I remember that the bank that prepared the conference, well, the chemical bank, no longer exists, but it was a very important bank. And we were in the middle of the conference, like we are right now, and suddenly there was the news of this terrible bomb in a commercial center in Bogota. Of course, the conference sort of failed, and the CEO of a very important company came to me and said, Minister Santos, your story about Colombia is a very pretty story, it's very attractive, but you will never have investment, real investment, if you continue that war. If you don't finish that war, you will never have good investment. And a few months later, I had to give the chair of something called the UNCTAD, United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. I was the chair of the 8th conference, and Nelson Mandela had been elected chair of the 9th conference. So I went to Johannesburg give him the chair of the United Nations conference, I put on the South African television, and I saw in real life something which was surreal. For the first time, the victims and the perpetrators of the war in South Africa were getting together, and they were being filmed in the television and shown to the whole of South Africa. And some of them embraced, others hit each other, others screamed. And I said, what is happening here? And that afternoon I had a 15-minute meeting with Mandela to give the chair of the UNCTAD. I asked him, what is this? And he sat down and he started explaining to me the purpose of bringing perpetrators and the victims and how important it was to heal the wounds. And the conversation, which was supposed to last 15 minutes, lasted 4 hours. It was one of the most interesting conversations I've had in my life. And at the very end, when he explained what he had done, he'd been in jail for 28 years and how it was difficult to forgive, all the process that he went through. At the end, he said, listen, and South Africa and Colombia have a lot of similarities. We're very rich countries. We have a lot of resources, but I will tell you, your country will never take off if you don't have peace. And so there, I think, is when I said, I remembered a lesson that I received many years before when I joined the Navy. And they taught me how to sail. I said, in order to sail, it's like in life, like in business, like in government. You have to know where you want to go. And you have to choose where you want to go. And I think it was at that moment when I said, well, my priority in life is to work for peace in Colombia. And I started to work for peace in Colombia at that time.
Mm-hmm. Did you encounter resistance within your own political party or within the conversation back home in Colombia about whether or not you should seek peace or whether that was advisable?
Oh, yes. I mean, was a very long process. And peace doesn't grow in the trees. Peace, you have to construct it. And there are many enemies of peace. And I had the opportunity of being a leader making war. I was Minister of Defense, war against the FARC. That type of leadership is relatively easy. It's a vertical type of leadership. You give orders, you have a strategy, you rally the people around you, and you go after your adversary. And as long as you win, you're in good shape. Making peace needs a completely different type of leadership. You have, instead of giving orders, you have to persuade. You have to persuade people to forgive. And it's very difficult to persuade a mother whose daughter had been raped and killed to be lenient with the perpetrators. That is very difficult. And when I was Minister of Defense, I was very effective making war. And they elected me because I was a war hero, the biggest amount of votes ever in the Colombian history. I had the largest popularity. And when I started to talk about peace, everybody around me said, no, don't do it. All your predecessors have failed, and they had failed. 6 presidents had tried to make peace and they had failed. You will fail again. Continue doing what you're doing. You're good at it. And in 4 years, you'll continue to be the most popular politician in Colombia. But there was this marvelous gentleman from Israel, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel. He said to me, he knew me, and he said, I know that you want to make peace. And I know that the people around you, your cabinet is telling you, continue the war. And you can continue the war. And probably you will be very popular in 4 years. And if you take the decision to sit down and start trying to make peace, you will lose your political capital. You will be called a traitor. Many of your friends will not speak to you again. But think of the following. Think that you will be in front of your grave at the end of your life, and you look back and you say to yourself, or you ask yourself, how many lives could I have saved if I had taken the risk of trying to reach peace? And would you go with that answer, with that question, with no answer, with your conscience at peace to your grave? And that argument convinced me to take the risk. And I took the risk. And still today, there are many people who were against this decision for political reasons, because there's never a peace process that is perfect. It's a negotiation between human beings that are killing each other. And in a nutshell, what a peace process boils down to is, where do you draw the line between peace and justice? How much justice is a society willing to sacrifice in order to have peace? And no matter where you draw the line, there will always be people who claim and demand more justice, and people who will claim and demand more peace. That's why most of the peace processes have been unpopular. Most of the peacemakers have been called traitors. Many of them have paid with their lives. Sadat, the Prime Minister of Israel, Rabin, they paid with their lives. But if the peace is well negotiated, then the peace process starts to become much more popular, and people start to realize that that is what was the correct thing to do. That is fortunately happening in Colombia. In the last elections, more than 80% of the people voted to continue and implement the peace process.
In your book, The Battle for Peace, you say that the major triumph would not be the death of the enemy, but something much greater, that is converting the former adversary into someone useful into society. Can you talk about how you encouraged members of the FARC to reintegrate into democratic society?
Well, carrot and stick. As Minister of Defense, I was very good at going after the leaders of the FARC. They had never been touched in 45 years of war. They were like landlords in their regions. They were untouchable. With a little help from my friends of the CIA, of the MI6, of the Mossad, I was able to start touching them. And I had studied many peace processes, and each peace process has special conditions, necessary conditions to be successful. In the case of Colombia, you needed to tilt the balance of military power in the favor of the state, because as long as the guerrillas think that they can win through violence, they will never negotiate in good faith. The commanders of the guerrillas have to be personally convinced that it's better for them to negotiate than to continue the war. And something very important, in today's world, every asymmetrical war, like the one we had in Colombia, in order to be successfully negotiated, needs the support of the neighbors. Because if the neighborhoods, the neighbors are used as safe havens for the insurgencies, then it's very difficult to bring him to the negotiating table. Well, I had to do a lot of diplomatic work with my neighbors, with Venezuela, Chavez, with Ecuador, Correa, with Brazil, Lula, and I convinced them to support the peace process. And that was absolutely fundamental. They were enemies. They didn't I didn't like Mr. Chavez, and he didn't like me. But I told him something that President Reagan had told Gorbachev. Reagan met Gorbachev in Geneva and told him, listen, Mr. Gorbachev, I will never become a communist, and you will never become a capitalist, but we can work together for something that is for the benefit of both and the world. Bring down the nuclear arsenal. And they did that. And I told Chavez, listen, I'm never going to become a Bolivarian revolutionary, and you will never become a liberal Democrat. But let's work together for something that will be good for Venezuela, for Colombia, and for the whole region, which is peace with the FARC. And he agreed, and he helped me. And he helped me convince the FARC that it was in their, that it was time to negotiate, that they would not succeed by continuing the violence. And of course, in the negotiation, we offered some carrots. You can become part of the Congress. We will make these reforms that you have been seeking for a long time, which were reforms that the country needed anyway. So it's a matter of sort of creating trust, creating empathy, and convincing that through violence they will never succeed, and that they could continue their fight, their ideological fight, but through democratic means.
Will you talk a little bit about your experience building coalitions within political or across political parties?
Well, I'm a great fan of reading biographies and learning from history, and copying what good statesmen have done before. And when I got elected president, I remembered I had read a book, a very good book about Abraham Lincoln called The Team of Rivals, by a very good American historian, Doris Kearns. What I did was exactly what Abraham Lincoln did when he won the presidential election. He invited his rivals in the presidential contest, the people who had ran against him in the election, to become part of the government. And I did exactly the same. The different political parties that ran against me, I won the election. My party won the election with the majority party, but we didn't have more than 50% in Congress. We needed more than 50% in Congress. So I invited many of the rivals, saying, listen, you have this program. I will put this program in my government, in my vision and my development plan, and you become my minister. And they all agreed. So I ended up with 85% of the Congress. And I did many, many reforms that were unthinkable before, by bringing people that were my rivals into the government. And this is something that is needed today, again, all around the world. Making transactions, saying, okay, you have this, I have that. That is what democracy is all about. I insist very often in the phrase that George Washington so much repeated about the ability to make transactions with moderation. If you lose that, then democracies are very difficult to maintain. And that is what we need now, to reach across the aisle, across different political frontiers, and find common denominators, find common ground in order to be able to live together, thinking differently. That doesn't matter, but talking to each other, agreeing on fundamental things that would benefit everybody, because if that does not happen, it's very difficult to have a government that will resolve the problems of the people.
What would you say to anyone, or particularly students or a person of any age, but who might say that they find it immoral to talk with or negotiate with someone who has a different political belief or a political philosophy from them?
Well, I was very much attacked. How do you dare sit down with these terrorists that were your and my enemies? The answer is very simple. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. You have to sit down with them. And there was a marvelous phrase of Nelson Mandela. He said, the most powerful weapon is to sit down and talk. And that's what I did with the FARC. After 50 years of war, they had not been beaten. We sat down, we talked, and they were disarmed, and they disappeared as a revolutionary armed group. Mandela did the same.
What effect or can you talk about the effect that media and journalism reporting had on your success, or perhaps did it make it difficult as you were negotiating peace?
That same question was made to me by exactly a month ago in Kiev by Zelensky. I was there. And he said, how did you manage the media, making war and peace at the same time? Your internal political opinion, your public opinion, and the outside world. The answer is not easy. Probably the most difficult aspect of a peace process, especially in the circumstances that we were making war and peace at the same time, is how to manage your communications. What is it that you should inform? Because if you inform everything, I say that a peace process is like a work of art. The artist never allow you to go and see the work when it's half done, because usually it's terrible. They allow you to go and see it when it's completed. The same with peace process. If it's half done, then everybody will start criticizing what you are doing, and then you lose your political support. So that's why it's so difficult to calibrate what you inform, what you don't inform, agree with your counterpart on a common strategy, because usually the other part wants to manipulate the press against you, or vice versa. So it is very difficult. In the end, I was taught a lesson. At the beginning, we agreed with the FARC that we would not inform on anything except when we had completed a specific point in the agenda. And that could last weeks. Well, what happened was that the vacuum that everybody was sort of curious of what is happening there, and since there is no information, the fake news started to become news. And they started to invent all kinds of lies about what was happening. And so I remember I was at a Security Council meeting in the United Nations. So it was about this time, some years ago, that when I saw in the New York Times and in the Washington Post something which was absolutely false, I said there's something wrong here, and we decided to change the policy and start reporting on everything that we were doing almost on a daily basis. So I did a very radical shift, but reporting on a daily basis also brings all kinds of reactions and problems. So there is no magic formula, but I learned that it's better to inform than not to inform.
Mm-hmm. How did you stay motivated to keep with pursuing peace through this long and tedious and difficult process? How did you?
I was at the beginning very confused of how to get motivated. And there was a professor, a former professor of mine, who went to Colombia and said, listen, President Santos, you're embarking in a very difficult and long journey. And you're going to feel the solitude of power. And you're going to, many times, be ready to throw in the towel, say, I won't continue. I advise you to talk to the victims, hear their dramas, and be encouraged by them to continue. So I had a great admiration for this professor, and I started talking to the victims every week, like making exercise every week or every day. I talked to the victims. And it was a marvelous experience. First of all, I thought the victims were going to be the most the reluctant to accept a peace process that would give legal benefits to the perpetrators because they were victims. And to my surprise, most of them at the very end said, no, President, after they told me these terrible stories, continue, persevere. And I asked them, why are you so generous? This means that the people who did this to you will have legal benefits. And to my surprise, they said, well, we don't want others to suffer what I suffered. So my vision of the human condition was enhanced tremendously. I will share with you one anecdote of many. I took this woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize with me because I said, she's the one who deserved the Nobel Prize and not me. She's this woman from the coffee region in Colombia. Her father had been killed. Her mother had been killed. Her two brothers had been killed. And her son had been tortured and killed. And a week, 5 days after she buried her son who was tortured before and killed, somebody came into her house. Her name was Pastora Mira. Somebody came into her house wounded, asking for help. And she put her son's bed, whom she had buried 5 days ago, at his disposal and cured him. Some days later, he was cured, and he went out of this small ranch and saw the picture of this lady with her son. And when he saw the picture, he knelt down and started crying and says, please, please don't tell me this is your son. And she said, yes, this was my son. He was tortured and killed. And he said, I'm sorry, crying. I was the one who tortured and killed your son. And this lady, he was kneeling down, crying, grabbed him by the elbows and said, stand up. And looked at him and embraced him and said, thank you. And he went crazy. Why do you thank me if I just told you I tortured and killed your son? And she said, yes, but by what you did, recognizing and asking for forgiveness, you liberate me from hating for the rest of my life. That was a very strong, marvelous story. Stories like that was what kept me going. Continue persevering no matter what.
And you found support in the international community as well.
That was crucial. The international community, because of there were many sui generis factors in the peace process that had never happened before. For example, putting the victims in the center of the negotiation, their rights. The victims have 4 rights: rights for reparations, for justice, for the truth, very important to the truth, and for non-repetition. These are rights that are specifically stipulated in something called the Rome Statute, which is an international treaty that was approved in the United Nations to facilitate peace process. So there are many aspects of this agreement that were not present before. The fact that 2 parties at war get together and create a special tribunal and agree to submit to it, that was unprecedented. And it's the first peace agreement that has a gender chapter, an ethnic chapter, and an indigenous community chapter. And so the international community became extremely interested, to the extent that the Security Council of the United Nations has never approved more unanimous resolutions than the ones they have approved in support of the Colombian peace process. And that was extremely important to also give more legitimacy to the process.
I know our audience has many questions they're probably waiting to ask, but I want to ask you one more before we turn it over to the audience. Will you tell us about your Compass Foundation and its mission and what you're doing in Colombia today?
Well, every Nobel Peace Laureate has a foundation. And what I did was to receive the money from the prize and created a foundation. It's called the Compass. It's like with peace in Spanish. And what we do there basically is to build peace in the grassroots. How? Identifying leaders from these regions that have been abandoned by the state for the last 50, 60 years, bring them to the best university in Colombia, teach them the tools, and then send them back to teach, for example, simply how to solve problems peacefully without killing each other, because they had been accustomed to killing each other for 50 years. To make peace with nature, to protect the environment. We are a very, very rich country in terms of biodiversity. To teach them to start businesses, and we have contacts with the big companies that could buy their products, and this is an ongoing concern. So we have building peace at the grassroots, and we also have something which many of you might be interested if you want to know more about the peace process. Because of the tremendous demand for information about what we were doing and what we did, many universities around the world, many researchers, what is it that you did here, there? We decided to get all the information of the peace process. When I say all the information, is even the notes of the guerrillas that they sent, or the message that they sent to the commanders in the jungle in the middle of negotiation. You know, their strategy, they are now willing to confess the tricks they did, and everything is in this open library, and it's free for everybody. We have more than 5,000 documents already, and we are feeding it almost on a daily basis. And I hope that with my alma mater, KU, we can make a marriage, and we are learning from the Dole Institute how to improve our archives and how to maintain the information. So I'm learning from Audrey also.
It was so fun talking to you about archives yesterday. All right, I want to, and I look forward to more. All right, so it's your turn, audience members. Before I turn it over to you, though, I want to make sure that you all know that we will be selling President Santos's book, The Battle for Peace, in the Simon's Media Room following the program. So please pick up your copy after our conversation. All right, do we have any questions out there in the audience? A student will come to you. All right, I have one here.
So standing
Please.
up, right?
Please stand. Thanks.
So you have done a lot of work during the, you've done a lot of work with wartime sort of counseling and bringing broken nations to peace, talking with Kiev, with Zelensky recently. Do you have any insight into just generally reducing polarization in a peacetime country like the US right now?
Well, I wish I did. And I was telling the students this morning at noon, the advisory students that
Student Advisory Board
of the board of the Dole Foundation and some Colombian students, how important it is for universities to start to come up with an answer to your question. Everybody's asking, how can we reverse this trend of increasing polarization? How can you counteract the effect of social media in strengthening the extremes? You automatically connect with the people that think like you think, and the more radical it becomes, the more interested you become, and so that is increasing the polarization. And it gets to a point where you don't even want to talk to anybody who thinks differently. And many of you will probably experience in the social media, if you have something that you don't like, you reject it. And that is extremely dangerous for a society to stop talking to the people who think differently, because that is what initiates wars. And believe me, I am trying to think how. I read an article the other day that has to do maybe with the William Manning White School of Journalism. Recuperate good journalism. Good journalism has also faded away. The role of the editor, the one that has the criteria to choose what is news and what is not news, and to interpret the curiosity of the readers or the TV audience. That power of the editor has disappeared, and now who is the one that determines the front page news? It's called the social trend. It's called the trending topic. It's called, what is it that we're going to highlight today? You look at the social media, what is the trending topic today or right now? Well, that's the news. So there's been a distortion of what was good journalism. And you see many of the TV stations, Fox, CNN, and more and more radicalized. And that is very bad for any democracy. But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for your question. What I can assure you is that your concern is my concern, and it should be the concern of everybody here. And that a university like the KU hopefully can come up with an answer in combination with the Dole Institute.
Yes, that is our mission. We're ready to rise to the challenge. All right, we have another question up here up front. Oh, we'll get you in a moment, Diana.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I guess coming.
Could you speak up?
Sorry. Hello. Thank you for coming this evening. I know soon there's an election in Brazil. I know it's Lula versus Bolsonaro. Some people have expressed concern that Bolsonaro might coup if Lula wins. I'm just curious how you feel about that possibility.
No, I don't. I personally don't think that if Bolsonaro loses, he will be able to stay in power. I must confess, I don't like Bolsonaro very much. But between Bolsonaro and Lula, I would prefer Lula. Lula is not my hero either, but I think he would be better for Brazil right now. But I think the military, even though Bolsonaro has tried to bring them in and convince them that they are the ones who will maintain him in power, I don't think that they will be willing to go against the will of the people. And it also depends on how close the election is. If it's very close, then you might have a problem. But the latest polls, I don't know if you believe the polls, you're going to have a meeting here with two pollsters in
Tomorrow. Yeah,
tomorrow.
4 o'clock.
Okay. Well, the polls sometimes are wrong, but if the polls are right, then the margin will be sufficiently big to not allow the military to do anything that will go against the Constitution. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, but this is the truth. All the world is looking at the U.S. All the world is worried about what is happening in the U.S. And many people around the world are saying, well, if a president in the U.S. can disregard the results of the elections, why can't we? And this is having an effect in all democracies. That's why I say, I hope and I pray to God that the democracy in the United States recuperates its role of being the example for democracies all around the world. Otherwise, all democracies will be in trouble.
Up here.
Thank you. You've given us much to think about. I do think you have the answer. and it's one word, empathy. When you said that, it was like in neon to me, because when you were talking about all these examples and had the importance of common ground, it seems to me that that is the vehicle by which you get there. So now that you have the word, what do we as educators, what do journalists need to do? Because I think we've lost the ability to empathize with the people on the other side. So how do we get there?
You're quite right. Empathy for me is to be able and willing to put yourself in the shoes of others. And that way you understand why they think differently. And we have lost also the capacity to feel empathy. We can recuperate that. But how do we do it? That's the problem. Leadership. Good leaders, one necessary condition to be a good leader is to have the capacity to feel empathy. If you don't understand the concerns, the dreams, the hopes, and the frustrations of the people you're going to lead, you can't lead. But how do you, if you don't have that capacity, how do you build it? That's what I say, that has to do with your education in your house, in your school, in your university. But I'm very worried. I have sons and I have grandsons. And the dialogue is in the house is less and less, and the monopoly of the gadgets is more and more. And that is having an effect on your capacity to build empathy. Maybe here at the UK, at the KU, you can make a research on that, but I feel it. I think that this is happening. But yes, I agree with you that the way to neutralize this polarization is by fostering empathy, or stimulating empathy, because then you can understand at least. But if you don't speak to the other person, then how can you feel empathy? That's a problem.
Other questions? Here in the back, and then we'll go to the middle here.
Perfect. Thank you so much again for coming. Just a quick question. Oh,
Can you speak up just a little bit?
is this better? Perfect. So FARC was fundamentally based upon economic and governance differences. What recommendations would you give to countries that face tensions in regard to ethnic or religious ties in terms of resolving those conflicts long term?
What recommendations I give to the country that what?
Could you repeat the question just a bit slower?
Yeah, so FARC was fundamentally based upon differences in thought in terms of how governance or economic thought would tend to occur, as they were more sort of prone towards Marxist or Leninist thought. What recommendations would you give to countries that face tensions tied towards religious or ethnic divides in terms of coming towards that peaceful resolution that you were speaking about earlier?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase it for me?
Differences based on religion or ethnic divides are different from political philosophy, right? Is that what you're saying? And is that different? Is negotiating between differences of that nature different than a political philosophy?
How can you negotiate with people who have different religions and different ideologies,
Yeah.
different...
Yes.
What recommendations would you give for a negotiation to solve a conflict that's based on ethnic or religious differences
Okay.
as opposed to economic or political background?
The same principles of finding common ground apply to sectors of human society that are different in race, different in religion. How can you agree on rules to live together without killing each other? The same as what you do when you're at war with people who are of the same race or the same religion applies to people who have different religions and different races. I mean, the principles are similar. Sometimes it's more difficult. Sometimes there is this added ingredient of reparations, ancient reparations. If you have a race that has been discriminated for a long time, then in a negotiation, then they will want extra reparations of some kind, be it indigenous people, black people. That makes the negotiation more difficult, but the principles are the same. How can you and I, if we think differently, if we are of a different race or we are of a different religion, can live together? That's the basic question. And you always, if you have the will, you will find common ground. That has been a constant in history also. Many wars, but many examples of people who were radically different and at war, of getting together and living together. But the same principles apply.
Thank you. We had one more question here in the middle.
Thank you for taking your time with us today, Mr. President. At the end of your perspective on peace, you said the words, "make peace with nature." And if I recall, that was one of the earlier promises you made before going to the Congress to take your oath of office. And during your term as president, you made several unique approaches to institutions with the environment. When we look at reports by like the high-level political forum from the UN and our progress with the sustainability developmental goals, or our failures in the Kyoto Protocol or our Paris Accords, what is your perspective that the international community needs to take in terms of key policies to get back on track in terms of sustainability, whether that would be sustainability economic, social, cultural, or environmental?
Well, that's for me, the biggest challenge that the world has right now. The most dangerous existential threat is climate change. And you are right, we are in Colombia, we are the most biodiverse country in the whole world per square kilometer. We're at the same time very vulnerable to climate change. I had an experience which taught me tremendously about the implications of climate change. When I became president, 3 weeks later, the worst Niña phenomenon hit Colombia. And we weren't prepared for that. I had to administer a flooded country for about a year and a half. And I brought in many people, many experts. Among them, Al Gore. Al Gore went to Colombia. He taught me about climate change. I was not aware of really what climate change was really about. I created the Ministry of the Environment. I started to protect our biodiversity in a strong way. We have something called, there's no translation, called páramos. These are sort of wetlands very high in the mountains, above 3,000 meters, which are factories of water. These ecosystems are only present in the Andes of South America, and Colombia has 50% of these. And these are 70% of our rivers come from these ecosystems, and we have more rivers than the US, we have more rivers than India, we have lots of rivers. And we need to protect them, because one of the things that in the near future we're going to start looking for is water. We are destroying sources of water. And you're right about the Sustainable Development Goals. That was a Colombian initiative that Latin America started to support. Finally, in Brazil, in the year 2012, the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals was approved, and then a fascinating negotiation between 2012 and 2015 about how many goals and what goals. This was a negotiation with the rest of the world. And finally, 7 years ago, in this marvelous, famous General Assembly of the United Nations in New York, and by this time, for the first time ever, every single country voted in favor of a resolution adopting the SDGs as a world agenda. Well, implementing the SDGs has become very difficult. Who pays for the transition to a green economy? The developing countries saying, well, the rich countries got rich at the expense of the developing countries, and they polluted the water, the air much more than we did, so they have to pay more. The rich countries say, no, we all pay the same. And it's an ongoing discussion, and the war in Ukraine has, in a way, diverted the attention of the need to be much more aggressive in stopping global warming. And so we need to repeat maybe the experts in political communications know very well that if you say something one time, nobody hears it. If you say it 100 times, nobody hears it. If you say it 1,000 times, nobody hears it. When you repeat it 5,000 times, maybe somebody will start hearing it. And that's why you have to repeat your message permanently if you want the people to understand and to be aware. Well, with climate change, it's the same thing. You have to repeat the message every single day. Remind the people of what is happening. Make them feel committed to putting a little effort on stopping global warming. And this cannot be done one time or 10 times. This has to be done on a daily basis everywhere. And I was telling the students this morning also what a big challenge that because it's their future. I mean, the ones who are going to suffer more the consequences of global warming are the young generations. And it's in their hands to keep pressing for more effective action in stopping climate change. It's the most important existential challenge that we have right now, and many people are not committed or aware of that.
We have time for one more question if there's anything right here.
Hello, Mr. President. Can you hear me all right? I just wanted to say that what you've done is pretty monumental and some could consider rare and very difficult to achieve. So I just wanted to know what your input would be to younger people who want to follow in your footsteps, what advice you would give them to try to achieve things such as you have in the political world and just like in the world in general.
What advice to follow my steps?
For students who would want to follow in your footsteps and, you know, try to achieve what you've achieved?
Graduated from KU, first of all. No, what I told you about the lesson that I received when I learned how to sail in the Navy, of having a port of destination, and no matter how the winds are, if they're against you or for you, you can use them to get there, but you need to identify what you want. Where do you want to go? And that is applicable to governments, to companies, to businesses, and to your personal life. I will tell you an anecdote which you might be useful for you. At the end of my government, I went to Davos to receive an award about and then I came back to Austria in a state visit. And they had just elected the youngest leader in Europe. Sebastian Kurz was his name, the Chancellor of Austria, elected 1 week before I arrived. Received me in these magnificent palaces in Vienna. Reminded me of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was very impressive. And suddenly we had a one-on-one, like you and I are here, and he said to me, President Santos, you've been in power for 8 years, you are a Nobel Prize laureate, you made peace in your country, you brought down poverty, you did this, you did that. I have just been elected and I don't have a lot of experience. What advice will you give me? You are a very successful head of state. And I was looking at this palace and I'm sorry, I am simply a Colombian president. I cannot give advice to an Austrian chancellor. But then I said, maybe with all humility, I will give you an advice. Sleep well. And he said, what do you mean sleep well? Yes, every night during the 8 years of my presidency, I went to brush my teeth and I looked at myself in the mirror and I asked myself, today, what did I do everything that I thought was correct? And if the answer is yes, you go to sleep with your mind in peace, and then you sleep like a baby. And I've slept like a baby for the 8 years because I did what I thought was correct. You might be mistaken. You might make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. You might be wrong. But if you did it in good faith, you will sleep well. You won't have regrets. That's my advice. And in state visits, the head of government, which was the chancellor in the case of Austria and Germany, and there's the president. And the president had done his research and he had discovered that I liked the opera, but I like specific opera. I don't like those long German operas, no. I like the happy ones, like Carmen, like Carmen. And he had in the Vienna Opera House, Carmen for me. I was the most fantastic. And so I was in the balcony, the presidential balcony with the president and my wife, and I was leaving next day at 7 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly the door opened of the balcony where we were, in the middle of the opera, and it was the chancellor, young head of the government, Sebastian Kurz, and said, Mr. President, I know you're leaving tomorrow very early, but I needed to talk to you before and thank you for the advice you gave me, because I've been thinking all day about it. And it really is a great advice, and I will try to sleep well for the rest of my life. So, sleep well.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's a wonderful way to conclude. Now, shall we get on with the recognition?
Please.
All right. Mr. President, on behalf of the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas, and in honor of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole, it's my honor to present to you the 2022 Dole Leadership Prize.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Audrey, and thank you all. I feel very honored. This is, has a special significance for me, coming from a person that I admire so much as Senator Dole and his wife, Elizabeth, and especially from his institute that is located in my alma mater. That means a lot to me. I am always, everywhere where I go, I say how proud I am of being a graduate from KU. And now I can say that I am a graduate of KU. I have an honorary degree of KU, and now I have this prize. And so that makes me very happy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Your work is not quite done. We've got books for you to sign. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We hope you'll come back tomorrow at 4 o'clock for our discussion group hosted by none other than Jerry Seib. If you're going to buy a book, you can get them in Simon's media room, and you'll pass through Rhodes conference room where the president will sign your book for you. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.